So before I set you off with some practice questions today, I wanted to start with a warm-up. And in this warm-up, I'm presenting you with a quadratic equation. Okay, it's a quadratic equation that looks a little different than those that I chose for my examples yesterday. Now, let's assume that in this question, they've asked us very specifically to utilize the quadratic formula to solve this, right? Sometimes a question is asked to test a particular skill. So let's assume in this case that the skill that's being tested is not your ability to solve in general, but your ability to solve using the quadratic formula. Now, having said that, if that weren't the skill being tested, if all I were being asked to solve for was the variable using the most efficient method possible, we need to remember that that may not be the quadratic formula. Let me show you. I'm going to solve this using what I already know, and I'm fairly certain you already knew walking into grade 10 math. And that is just to use simple algebra. So 2w squared minus 3 equals 0. I know that my job is to figure out what w is. So I'm going to move this negative 3 to the other side. That will, cleaning this up, I'm going to get 2w squared equals 3. Now I'm going to divide by 2 on each side to isolate my w squared. Cleaning that up, w squared is equal to 3/2. Now I need to deal with this square, and so how do I undo a square? Well, I take the square root, and of course whatever I do to one side I do to the other. Now we know that whenever we take the square root of a value, there's always a positive and a negative possibility there, right? And so I know that if I were to type in this into my calculator, if I wanted a decimal rather than a representation such as this, that I can plug that in, and I'm going to get a positive result and a negative result for that value. Okay, so that's using algebra. To me, that was fairly straightforward, and I didn't need to remember the quadratic formula at all. But let's assume you're faced with a question where you are asked to use the quadratic formula specifically to solve a quadratic equation. How would you go about this? So I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller, and I'm going to remind you what the quadratic formula is. Now in this case, my variable is w, and so I'm going to use w as my starting variable. So w is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, right? So that is my quadratic formula. And since I'm solving for w specifically, I'm going to use the variable w instead when I write out my formula. Now back to this question. Now normally what we would start to do is we would say, well, what are A, B, and C? What is A? Oops. What is A? What is B? And what is C? And then I would take the next step and substitute the values that I get into my quadratic formula to solve for my variable. So let's take a minute to do that. So pause the video, write down what the values are for A, B, and C in this question. So what I'm hoping that you were able to come up with is that, well, A is always found by looking at the coefficient of my squared term. And since my squared term is this guy and its coefficient is a 2, the value of A for this problem is 2. Now I look for B. Well, B is always the coefficient of my linear term. My linear term, or my term with an exponent of 1. Now it doesn't appear to me right off the bat that term exists in this equation. But we could think about this equation as being written like this. So 2w squared plus 0w minus 3 equals 0, right? Now, we know that we would never normally include the 0w plus 0w because it really doesn't change this formula too much. But it does give us some insight into what the value of b would be. So the value of b is in fact 0. So even though we're not writing in that linear term, we can assume its coefficient is 0, which is why it doesn't appear in the overall equation that we started with. And so lastly, the value of c is found by looking at the constant term. The constant term is -3 here. And so now it's business as usual. I'm just going to go ahead and utilize my values for a, b, and c and plug them into my quadratic formula and solve. So at this point, I want you to go ahead and do that. Pause the video, try the example, and then we'll compare answers. Okay, so let's take a look at the result here. So when I went ahead and I substituted my values for a, b, and c into the quadratic formula, I ended up with w is equal to plus or minus root 24 over 4. Now what I did then is, and you will learn how to simplify these radicals, these roots in grade 11, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this course. So I went ahead and I just plugged this all into my calculator. I know that one of my answers is the positive version, the other one is going to be my negative root. But nevertheless, I got positive 1.22 and negative 1.22. And if I go ahead and I plug in over here the answer that I got solving it algebraically, I get the same answers. So that's another way of me checking that my answers are correct. So there you go. Pick your poison. Both of these methods work. I personally prefer the algebraic route, but if you're asked to solve using the quadratic formula specifically, then you need to account for how missing terms are going to appear as a, b, or c in our quadratic formula. So good luck with your questions today. If you have any concerns or questions with respect to the practice, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to help.